Welcome back to Extra Points, where this week's foray into mediocrity, as we like to say, is accompanied by Larry Cotlar, Mark Hansen, and yours truly, Al Lorenzen, each and every week. And Larry, those of us that know you, you've been a fixture here in Des Moines for a couple stints. You've been around the sports scene. You're one of the hardest working guys that we know. But I want you to kind of, for our viewers, go back and kind of give us the beginning. How did you get into the sports broadcast world, and how has that evolved here over the years?
Well, and there's a lot to go back on.
Yeah.
Trust me, there's a lot to go back on. Well, when you're in college, and I was at the University of Missouri, they tell you have to pick a major at some point. And I decided, well, I don't want to sit behind a desk for 8 hours a day. It was a process of elimination. I thought about music for a while because I played the string bass.
Yep.
But that seemed a little too hard.
That's something we have in common. I played the string bass when I was
I did not know
younger.
that either.
Yeah.
Well,
when I was in elementary school, I was the only one big enough to hold one.
Well,
And
I too play the string bass.
Did you?
Not really.
he played with a catgut tennis racket.
There you go.
That's it.
Okay.
so anyway, so I decided, all right, here's what I don't want to do. What do I want to do? And I kind of made up a fantasy job.
Yep.
And I said, if I had my druthers, I'd be the play-by-play voice of the St. Louis Cardinals because I'm from St. Louis.
Yep.
And I thought, well, why not pursue that? And then I got into radio in Columbia, and just on and on we went through the small markets of places like Hannibal, Missouri, which was my first full-time job, and Shenandoah, Iowa,
Nice.
which was a real treat to work in.
And doing sports this whole time.
And doing sports.
Yep.
You did some news, though, as I recall.
I did news. Well, I did news and sports because back in those days, when you went to radio stations, they didn't have just sports. I mean, you had to
you
do
did
news.
everything.
You had to do everything, which I think is one of the best things that ever happened to me. Getting to learn the entire business. I've been a disc jockey, places like KGGO and KC14, the album station.
Wow.
Evolved, and then ended up at WHO. And I think that's where you and I met. And
Yep.
I think same thing
Yes.
with Mark over at WHO, working over there. And I actually started there in news, but then got involved with a little show called Saturday Sports Line. I don't know if you guys remember the
Wow.
Yes.
weeknights.
And give us a time for, clearly
Yeah.
you were young for your age, but give us a timeline. When was that?
1981.
Yep.
I started there at WHO. What happened was that I was asked to do election night coverage in 1980, and I went to the Warren County Courthouse down in Indianola. It was kind of a test run to say, all right, can this guy make it? And I remember Larry Wentz saying to me, he says, well, you're a disc jockey. You can do news? And I said, well, yeah, I have a journalism degree from the University of Missouri. So went there and obviously passed the audition, and then was working news, and then suddenly they came up with Saturday Sports Line from 1 to 6 on Saturday afternoons at a time.
From 1 to 6.
Yes.
5 hours of radio.
5 hours of sports talk at a time. And Mark, you and I have talked about this.
Yes.
Back then, you didn't have sports talk radio.
Right, that's
I mean,
right.
just that weekly sports line show.
Yep.
So we had to somehow start that. My first guest was Wayne Krecklow,
I remember
called the
Wayne.
Boston Celtics,
Yep.
and started doing that. And then I moved into the evening area, and between myself and Jim Zabel and a guy named Mike Lee. There might be a few
remember
people
him,
remember
yeah.
Mike
Yep,
Lee. We
absolutely.
started doing the sports line show, and then we just kept going and going, and then on to left
Was
there.
it a call-in show? Was it where you?
It was a call-in show, sure.
See,
No, it
5
was-
hours is a long time.
Well, I had a co-host.
Yep. Well, even then. Yeah.
Yes, I worked with a guy.
We have trouble doing 30 minutes here.
I understand. Well, I worked with Mike Lee for a while.
Yep.
And then, of course, went over to do the regular sports line shows with Jim Zabel and Mike Newell on occasion. And so,
I had the pleasure of working with Mike Newell.
yes, we all have.
We sure have. I remember, I know all your work in this market, but I also remember when I'd be driving home from some sporting event after covering it for the Register. I'd turn on the radio, and there you would be from Las Vegas or Chicago, I remember.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting to hear you. I know that guy, and tell us about that experience.
Well, there was one. I left WHO 1991 and went out to Las Vegas to work in a national network, and pretty much sight unseen, didn't know what I was getting into. It was called the Sports and Entertainment Network. Started out 2 to 6 in the morning, which is a very difficult shift. But then started doing weekends, and I had mentioned to the people there, I said, why don't you try to hook me up with WHO, make them one of your affiliates at least for 1 hour, because as you guys know, we did Sound Off.
Sure,
Mike Newell and I created Sound Off back in the early 80s. So I said, well, there's another affiliate for you. At least pick them up. And WHO decided to pick up the show for an hour. That's probably what you heard on a Saturday afternoon, that suddenly they're picking up my show from Las Vegas for an hour.
From Mandalay Bay, or where were you broadcasting from?
No, we
It's
were
gotta
just
be
in a regular
someplace
studio.
glamorous, right?
No, not at that time. It was just a regular studio.
when you look back on your time and some of the events or personalities that you've covered, what sticks out? What are the things or the experiences that you really remember?
The number one experience, and this goes back to the Saturday Sportsline days in the '80s, I decided I'm going to go get an interview with Charlie Finley. I said, this is a guy that fascinates me. And I called his office. We got it set up for a Saturday, one Saturday, and I remember calling him that morning to confirm, and he goes, well, I don't know anything about this. And I go, what? And I had to talk him back into the interview. We started the interview at 4:15 that afternoon. And I'll tell you, you'll see why this is important. Because we used to go for half-hour interviews, like 4:15 to 4:45, and then we did like a fishing report, and we did some other things, and have another guest. So we get to 4:45, and Charlie says, do you want to go some more? And I said, sure, I'm not going to.
You're Charlie Finley.
You're Charlie Finley, right? So we take it to the top of the hour. And usually by that time you break, you got news and everything. He goes, you want to do some more? I said, sure. So we did it all the way to 5:15, and even then, I had another guest coming on, Bob Golby, who actually was one of the guys who started the senior tour, along with Julius Boros. And I said, I have another guest coming up. He says, well, if he's not there, call me back and we'll go some more. And,
wow.
I mean, I can't tell you what the interview is about. Probably orange baseballs and all the things, and the mule and things like that. But that always stood out to me.
Wow.
Because I talked to Charlie Finley for an hour, and he wasn't always the friendliest guy, but on that day, he was into it. And
So
it was
you go
fun.
from having to talk him back into the interview
Right.
into doing an hour with him.
Yeah, and that will always stand out. I mean, there's some national interviews. Spencer Haywood, I thought, was terrific. We had a good time doing that. John Chaney, when he was coach at Temple. I remember one time I called the SID, and I said, I'd like to do an interview with John Chaney. He goes, well, how long you want to do it? Usually you do it 10, 15 minutes.
Sure.
And he goes, well, no, he doesn't want to do it that short. He says, if you can't give him at least a half hour. I said, oh, he's got it.
Yeah, that's not a problem.
We can do that. So I love long form interviews.
Speaking of hanging on, hang around. We'll do another segment
Sure.
here. We got to pay some bills.
Okay.
Stay tuned for more extra points after these messages.